For Our Soil's Sake is brought to you by Holistic Management Canada. My hope is to feed our souls by having meaningful conversations with farmers, producers, and experts in agriculture to get a greater understanding of management practices that mitigate climate change, improve water quality, build soil health, and enhance habitat and biodiversity on agricultural landscapes. To give those of us who live in the city a better understanding of how what we consume directly affects our health and the health of the land. My name is Bronwyn Green, and I'll be your host. So for our soil's sake, let's dig right in. Thank you for tuning into our show today. Joining us today, we have Anna Hunter, owner of Longway Homestead. Longway Homestead is a 140-acre fiber farm that's just located outside of Winnipeg in St. Genevieve, Manitoba. Anna and her husband Luke raise Shetland sheep on pasture. This past summer, they were involved in Holistic Management Canada's Regenerative Accelerator program. This program sets out to speed up the adoption of regenerative agriculture practices here in Manitoba. So welcome, Anna. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Did you want to start off by saying a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a mom to two boys. I am a spouse to my husband, Luke, who I farm with and share a business with. And I'm a business owner, and I would say I am a passionate climate and social justice activist and advocate.
Love it. Awesome. And how long have you guys been farming for?
We moved to Manitoba from Vancouver in 2015, and I'm not sure how you define starting our farming journey, but I would say it started the minute we found our 140-acre piece of land east of Winnipeg, because that's when I say that we started becoming the stewards of that land and we started making decisions that would affect that land positively or negatively. So it wasn't until a year later in 2016 that we actually had our first livestock. But I think the journey started in 2015.
Nice. Okay. And then before that, what led you to this? I know that, yeah, we don't have as many fiber farmers here in Manitoba. So what got you interested in that?
Right. So in 2009, I opened up a community based yarn store in Vancouver, British Columbia. My goal was to create a 100-mile yarn store. So, source wool and yarn that had all been grown and manufactured within 100 miles of Vancouver. And as I looked for farmers and suppliers for that yarn shop, I discovered that despite there being quite a few sheep farms in the lower mainland and Fraser Valley, there actually wasn't any available yarn. And being someone that was committed to consuming local food and supporting the local food movement, I was really surprised that even though Canada has many sheep farms, there wasn't this local wool option. So I opened up my store anyways, but I sort of had this thing in the back of my mind that we need to be closer connected to our clothing and our textiles the same way we're connected to our food. So in 2015, Luke and I really wanted a closer connection to the source of our food and our fiber for our two boys and for ourselves. And that's when we made the decision to sell the yarn store and move to somewhere that we could actually start that journey of growing our own food and fiber. So we moved to Manitoba, where Luke had family, and we found our place in 2015. And I wouldn't say we had this big plan. We didn't know how it would look. We were both first generation farmers with no experience in agriculture. And I don't even know if before we moved, I understood what regenerative agriculture was, or if I had necessarily even heard the term. But once we made that decision, I just started that journey of reading and understanding and research and learning everything I could, and really addressing the issue of fiber farming. So, um, I think a lot of people don't understand that our clothing is also agriculture. We are even further disconnected from our clothing. We never see where it's made. We never see people who actually produce our clothing, but even more so, we never realized that clothing actually also comes from the land. And so actually turning it into a business was a little bit of a longer journey, um, but it was something that I immediately felt was missing within the context of agriculture in Canada and agriculture in North America, and that we needed to start addressing it and talking about it. And that's kind of how it started.
Absolutely. And so you guys were originally in Vancouver. Was moving to Manitoba like terrifying, or did you did either of you know anybody or have any connections here in Manitoba that you could kind of use them as a resource moving, or was it just all new and you just kind of went with it?
We had family in Winnipeg, so we knew, and that was certainly a motivation for choosing Manitoba, was that there would be family and that family support. I've moved a lot across the country. I've lived in lots of different regions in Canada and internationally as well, and Luke as well. So I think moving to a new place wasn't necessarily overwhelming or scary, but definitely moving into a rural community and everything that comes along with rural living was quite a shock. And that was probably more challenging than anything else. But we were really interested and committed to what we were doing. So I think maybe that excitement and that commitment overtook all the fear and anxiety of a brand new adventure where we actually had no clue what we were doing.
Right. And so where does the passion stem from? Does the it couldn't it probably isn't just one thing. The idea of like, did you have passion for fiber and yarn? That's why you opened up the store, which led to this, or does your passion come from the land and having a greater connection with it?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure if it's either of those things. So, before I opened up my yarn store, I worked as a community legal advocate in the downtown east side, and I was really focused on urban struggle, specifically around housing, homelessness, and poverty. And, for the previous 10 years, I had been actively engaged in community organizing to fight for the rights of homeless and poor folks in Vancouver, and and within that commitment to social justice also was this commitment to environmental justice and understanding the impacts that our globalization and trade liberalization and our capitalist mentality commit entrenched people in poverty, contributed to climate chaos. I think in general, I was just passionate about changing those things in our world. And so, although it might not be a very linear line from being an anti poverty activist in the downtown east side to then owning a retail craft store to then being a sheep farmer, to me, it's all different expressions of a similar passion, which is to um, educate people on the implications of our decisions and our, sort of globalized system, and then also work to create an alternative. And so working in the downtown east side, it was more engaging in tip of the spear activity, right? Like actively fighting for the rights of people in that community. Um, my community based yarn store was more creating safe spaces and alternatives for folks. And now I see the farm and what we're doing through the farm as creating more alternative systems, specifically in terms of clothing and textiles, and highlighting the negative impacts of our current system of consumption.
Right. That's awesome. And so, like, a part of that, to me, a huge part of that is education. So, like, me being in university and I just alone didn't like the idea of how much like plastic was being used and things like that. And I remember it was years later that someone told me that like plastic is in our clothes, and I was just like astonished that I had no idea that this was happening. And then again this morning, on Fibershed, one of the Instagram accounts I follow, they talked about the idea that like 20% of our plastic that makes up our plastic usage is actually in our clothing. And so I feel like a lot of people don't have connection to their clothes and how it's made, don't even understand this concept. So do you feel like a responsibility, or do you take on some of that responsibility in educating the public about that, as well as farming, so that you can provide that fiber for an alternative way of getting your clothing?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the outset, our clothing and textile system is so incredibly backwards, and we consume clothing without even understanding all of those implications. And 150 years ago in Canada, we were growing and processing 90% of all the clothing we consumed, and it was mostly wool and flax and hemp, flax to linen and hemp. And now, we are growing and producing less than 2% of all the clothing we consume. So, first of all, we've just lost the ability, the knowledge, and the infrastructure to grow and process our own clothing. But even worse than that, now the majority of the materials used to make our clothing are synthetics. And, synthetics were only first developed in Canada in 1929. And it grew exponentially and took over the prevalence of natural fibers in our industry, and no one really even understood what that meant. So microplastics in our clothing, when we wash them, they're getting into our waterways, into our air. Um, and when we look at the life cycle of our clothing, those microplastics are off gassing in landfills. They're taking hundreds of years to break down, and we don't even think about it. So I'm, in agriculture spaces, I'm always shocked at how many people are committed to this idea of traceability and local food systems, yet we're all wearing clothing that was definitely not grown here, was definitely not manufactured, traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to reach us, and is made up of, really fragile plastic materials. And there isn't an alternative. With the exception of Fibershed and the work that Fibershed is doing, there aren't really local places to get our clothing. And so I'm not yet providing an alternative. That answer is so big, but I feel like I'm starting a conversation, and
Absolutely.
having a farm that people can come visit and saying, here's the sheep that are growing the wool, here's the mill that's manufacturing it into the yarn, and here's the ways that we're making your clothing, is the beginning of a conversation that will hopefully lead to a revolution in how we use and consume and discard our clothing.
Absolutely. Wow. Um, okay. What are some other this kind of jumping away from it, but what are some other favorite things that you have about farming? So all this encompassing, of course, makes sense of why you enjoy it. Are there other things that you enjoy about farming? Like, yeah, every day-to-day things.
Um, Yeah, I mean, I think I love almost everything about farming at this point, but I recognize I'm still fairly fresh and new in it. So perhaps that's part of why what I love so much about it is that I'm learning so much every single day. There are new things for me to learn, and um I just feel, I didn't grow up in agriculture, but my dad did grow up on a grain farm in Saskatchewan. So my understanding of agriculture was very limited in terms of commercial crops and livestock systems, and to come across regenerative agriculture and permaculture and other ways of farming has been sort of like this breath of fresh air that I had no idea existed. So I really love the fact that I can learn so much. And I truly love sheep. I think they're just a beautiful, phenomenal creature. I love how they interact with each other. I love how they interact with us. I love how they interact with the land. I love lambs. I know that's probably a really easy answer, but being a part of that birth and that new life process is pretty magical and something I get to witness every single year. And then probably the other thing I love, which maybe isn't really answering your question, but it's the connections that I have found with other farmers and with other people that are equally as passionate about land and soil health and climate and food systems. And to me, that is hopeful for our future.
Absolutely. And so, you talked so just to give, like, our listeners a little bit more information about you and your farm is that, you raise the sheep yourself, and then, you obviously have the wool sheared off, and then you mill it, and create yarn, but you also do that for other farmers in the area, correct?
Yeah, so in 2016, we got our first sheep. We, had them for a year. We went to shear them. I took the wool to go get it processed and realized there were no wool processing mills in Manitoba, which came as a shock because I just assumed being a province with such a strong sheep population, there would be manufacturing, but there wasn't. And that started us on a journey of filling that niche. And in 2018, we opened up the only wool mill in Manitoba. So we process, and we're a very small mill. We do small batch, which has its own advantages. The big disadvantage being that we're limited in how much wool we can actually manufacture. But we process the wool from our flock, and then we buy wool from farmers across the prairies to manufacture and sell under our own label. But then we also provide that service for farmers that want their wool processed into products that they can then use or they can sell. So, we've tried to be this important step in getting that agricultural commodity into the hands of consumers. And 90% of all the wool grown in Canada is shipped overseas, where it's processed in China, the world's largest wool manufacturer. And then those goods are shipped back to us and shipped back to other places. So farmers are not receiving compensation for that commodity in a way that reflects how hard they work and how valuable it is. And it's also just a very broken system of this raw resource that's being shipped overseas and then shipped back and manufactured in low wage countries with less environmental practice standards. And so we really wanted to create an alternative, and really shrink that processing um, pipeline, I guess, for lack of better word, and draw attention to the fact that we could manufacture more clothing and textiles locally and um, yeah, provide those opportunities for farmers to actually see that product go to market quicker and with more traceability. So that was really the goal, and we're bumbling our way through it. Manufacturing is another huge industry that we didn't know anything about. So um, yeah.
Right. Okay. It's very fascinating. What would be some of the other big challenges that you faced in farming so far up to date?
Um, I don't know if you're looking for like specific or more broad answers.
Whichever, yeah, it
Um,
could be broad or if you have a specific thing that was like, this was really challenging and you didn't expect it.
Well, I mean, I think when you look at sheep farming in Canada, most of the focus and the information out there is on producing quality meat and carcass size, and whether you're intensively managing or holistically managing or whatever, the focus is on meat, and the wool is just a byproduct. So for us to be focusing entirely on the wool, we've had to really sort of reinvent that information and that focus. And there is a real lack of information out there on how to produce the best wool, and that actually really does affect feeding systems and shearing and timing of when you shear versus when you're lambing, or um, so a lot of that has been something we've had to figure out on our own. And so I would say that that was a challenge, although I'm happy now that we have dug in and really explored that and figured out some of that information. Definitely having healthcare vet options for sheep in our region is a really limiting factor. So it does feel sometimes like we're really going it alone with certain things. And then just dealing with the constant shift in climate and weather. In the last 3 years, we've experienced severe drought and severe flooding. So, as new farmers and as farmers that are trying to build a lot of resiliency into our farming operation, it's been a challenge.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And so my question, and like just to give some information to those who don't farm and maybe don't understand the difference between farming for meat and farming for fiber, I guess the idea there, the challenge would lie in when you're farming for meat. If something goes wrong with the animal or something like that, it's easy to like cull that animal and then put it into processing, as opposed to like what's the life cycle of a sheep for fiber. Like how long would you expect that sheep to be able to live out a healthy life so that it would continue to produce fiber and an income for you guys?
Yeah, it does sort of depend on both the breed that you're raising and those particular animals, but I would say your best wool quality is going to happen within the first 5 years of that animal's life. So, that's sort of what I would consider in terms of the quality. Just like human hair, sheep fiber, loses its quality the older the animal gets. So it is breeding is incredibly important, especially for flocks like mine, where we're breeding for color, so colored wool. That plan, finding breeding stock that can contribute to a fiber flock. Many of the fiber flocks out there are heritage breeds or specific breeds that are harder to find than the predominant meat breeds across the country. Um, Attracting quality shearers that are available within a time frame. Sheep go through a natural break in their wool during lambing. So, timing your shearing with lambing is actually really critical if you want the best quality wool product you can get. But in a country where we are limited on shearers and they're challenging to find or schedule within that proper time frame, for a meat farmer, it doesn't really matter as much. But for those that are focusing their marketability entirely on that wool clip, it's really crucial. So, yeah, some of those things are things we have to consider that, people raising sheep for food aren't necessarily considering in the same way.
Yeah, fascinating. Do you have mentors or like groups that, coming from not having any family doing this, how did you guys find help and like mentorship with this process?
Um, I found a few folks in the industry that were raising sheep, and so I sought some mentorship there, just in terms of basic animal husbandry and land management. I have found a few incredible fiber farmers that have been raising sheep for wool for many years, and they've been invaluable in that. And they've really advocated for the industry. And I've read every single book out there on wool farming and wool and fiber, and then obviously discovering Holistic Management Canada and regenerative practices and the other farmers in the region that are um, pursuing that, not necessarily for wool, but just for land management in general, has been really incredible. And I feel like I still am learning so much and have so much more to go and to do. Um,
Right. I feel like you're on your way of being that mentor for everybody. I feel like I refer to you lots when I talk to people about fiber farming and say that, oh, you have to talk to Anna Hunter because she knows so much. Um,
Yeah, well, and I mean, it's a really interesting time in the industry, in the sheep industry, I would say, because Canadian wool now, the majority of our sheep are being raised for meat across the country, but they're still producing wool.
yeah,
And maybe that isn't wool that we want to wear next to our skin, but it is this incredible product that is um, temperature regulating, antibacterial, renewable, biodegradable. It has it's a carbon sink. Wool is made up of 50% carbon. It's this beautiful resource that farmers, even really good farmers, are taking into the bush and burning, or taking to the landfill. And so we have this broken wool system in Canada, and we need a shift. And so part of what I'm doing in my work is also advocating and trying to create opportunities for that shift to happen. So, looking at the entire wool system and saying, how can we change what is going on and create local opportunities for using wool? So, in 2021, we bought a pelleting machine, just the same sort of pelleting machine that you would use for feed, and now we're pelleting waste wool. We're buying it from farmers and we're pelleting it, and we're using it as a fertilizer for gardens, and we're selling it to greenhouses and to gardeners. And it is replacing synthetic forms of nitrogen fertilizer, and it's also keeping this wool out of landfills. And it's a first step in creating a larger vision of keeping Canadian wool in Canada for domestic production and systematically replacing synthetic products. So the next goal is to begin producing wool insulation, which has the exact same or superior qualities to that of synthetic insulation, yet it's
That
wool.
is fantastic. Wow.
Yeah, and the Canadian wool clip is excellent for projects like that. So, at this point, whether a sheep farmer is regenerative or not, that wool is such a valuable resource, and it pains me to think of how, um, you know, secondary it is to all these operations. And the simple fact is, we've just lost the infrastructure, and that's what we need to focus on.
Right. It's so fascinating. So fascinating the idea of how the actual raising of the animals themselves and how that plays a part on the ecosystem. But there's this whole other part that we're not talking about, which is what happens to the wool afterwards and how that affects our ecosystems and our lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I've really been digging into some of the international research on wool and how it holds so much hope in addressing our climate chaos. But 1 kilo of dirty sheep's wool hangs on to 1.8 kilos of CO2 equivalents, and that's kind of powerful when we think about the resources that we use, the resources we wear, the resources we put in our homes. Wool has the potential to do so much more. Plus it's taking fiber shed. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about fiber shed, if your listeners understand what the fiber shed concept is. But fiber shed has this excellent quote where they say, what carbon pool are your clothing is your clothing coming from? Is it this carbon pool in the atmosphere where that carbon is being taken in by plants and eaten by ruminants and then turned into wool or fiber? Or even in the case of flax and linen and hemp, from the ground? Or is it carbon being taken from the ground? And our microplastic clothing, our nylon and acrylic and polyester, that is all um, made from fossil fuels. So I think from at a very base level, we need to start asking those questions and doing everything we can to create clothing and textiles that are, regenerative ultimately.
Yeah, I agree. Wow. Um, okay, so to kind of bring it back to the holistic management, when did you first hear about holistic management and like the concept of regenerative farming?
I think it was probably the winter of 2016. I took every book out of the library that I could possibly find on farming sheep, and I got a book on fencing, on how to build fencing for livestock. Because again, first generation farmers, no farming in our family, and we didn't know anyone in Manitoba at this point. I just assumed I needed to figure out for myself how to put in, permanent fencing, because that was what I thought we did. And this book referenced electric net fencing. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. And so I just started researching. And I think that led me to the whole concept of rotational grazing, or managed grazing, which then led me to reading more. And then I came across Alan Savory's holistic management book, and I bought the audiobook because I was still feeling very connected to the city, and I ended up doing a lot of driving in that first year. And then I also bought a hardcover, so I was like simultaneously listening to holistic management, and then reading the hard copy. And I think that really made an impact, and it stuck. And then I just said, this is what we want to aim for. This is where we want to try and go in our goals for our land. So I mean, I think sometimes I'm a little embarrassed to admit that we started this without any idea of what we were doing or how we wanted to do it. And the land-based goals came later, but I guess that's our story, so I got to own it. And
Yeah, you just jumped right in. That's great.
yeah. And then realized there was this community of people in Manitoba. And I believe in 2017 there was a holistic management conference, or maybe it was 2018 in Manitoba, and holistic management had invited Stephanie Wilkes from California, who wrote a book on shearing, and she's a big part of Fibershed California. And I was like, oh, she's one of my idols. I've got to get into this conference so I can go hear her. And we had also started a Fibershed chapter in Manitoba. And I think I reached out to Dana, and I was like, we need to be connected on this. And that was it. I kind of threw myself in there, whether they wanted me or not.
Nice. That's awesome. And so the regenerative accelerator program that you applied for and got this spring and summer, did holistic management reach out to you and you applied for that program, or was there like a project that you guys were hoping to implement this year and they kind of just coincided and then you were kind of looking for grants and things like that, or how did the program come to you?
I think I found it. I think I found the grant and the Regenerative Accelerator program on the website. And, I did have a plan in mind. And so I applied for it and got it and was very excited about it. And then, as things do, our plans changed. And I have been in this state of trying to let go of certain plans and see maybe a smarter plan. So I think, if anything, the Regenerative Accelerator program this summer helped me realize that I don't have to go so big. I actually can just really focus on where I'm at, and working to improve what we're doing with what we have. So maybe that's been the biggest advantage of the accelerator program for me, is really helping me redefine what is manageable, both for my own personal energy and for my family. I have lots of big plans, but sometimes have to remember that there isn't endless amounts of energy, and we just have to focus on what's right in front of us.
Right, absolutely. And so what was the project that you ended up implementing?
Um, well, we're still in the process of it, but I think with 2 summers of pretty severe drought in our region, and then this past summer, serious flooding and lots of precipitation, I have again, and we're in a really low lying area of Manitoba. I joke that we have swamp sheep because we're basically on the edge of this beautiful wetland. And so I think focusing on water capture, both for creating resilience in those drought years, but then also being able to divert that water into a better use during wet years, is our plan. So, still actually kind of figuring out what that will look like, um, practically. But I've definitely learned some really exciting opportunities. And most of the folks in our region are looking to divert water and remove it completely off the land, which was really shocking to see in the drought years. How much that devastated everyone when there was no water to divert. And so trying to build a different plan.
Right.
I don't know if that's specific enough for what you're looking
No,
for.
that's great. No, that's great. That's a really hot topic coming from a year of drought and then to an excess of water this year, I think that's a pretty hot topic for most people, or most people farming at least right now.
Yeah.
Okay, now kind of my pipeline or my pipe dream question is
Oh.
if you had an endless amount of money, endless amount of resources, and endless amount of energy or time, what would you do on your farm?
Oh, I love that question. And that's the space I find myself living in most of the time, is if I had
Oh,
endless energy and money, what would I do?
oh, me too. I
Um,
can dream big, but then I have to bring it back down to reality.
yeah, be realistic. Well, and I don't think that's a bad characteristic, because I think then when opportunities show up, you're ready to go. You have a plan. You already know where you want to take things. So, I've been kind of thinking a lot in the space of wool and textiles and um regenerative regenerative fiber farming, this whole concept of scaling deep, and rather than scaling up. And so, the biggest barrier, like I said before, is infrastructure for getting regenerative clothing and traceable textiles into the hands of consumers. And that's where I see things going. The biggest bottleneck, and this is maybe a little obscure for your listeners, but the biggest bottleneck in wool processing is the scouring or the washing. It takes a lot of water and a lot of energy. But I've been working with the School of Natural Resources and some local folks to look at how we can best utilize that water resource. Both because scouring wool means you're left over with this amazingly nutrient rich compost water. How can we scale up the wool washing while using that wastewater to irrigate places that need it? And so I would develop a scouring facility, which would double and triple the amount of wool that can be processed in the province. And then I would add infrastructure to not only process wool into wool insulation, and work with partners on how to basically be trailblazers in Manitoba around the production of wool insulation, and partnering up with builders to use that, but then also scale in a way that is producing finished textiles using locally grown and manufactured wool, off of regenerative farms. So that's where I would go.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Have you been dreaming about that for a little while, or it's kind of turned growing as you find out about the idea about this insulation?
Um, I think that uh everything has just sort of revealed itself to me as I've dug into the industry. Like, I didn't understand before I had the mill that scouring was the big bottleneck in Canada. And as I've talked with other mill owners across the country, it seems really clear that that is the issue. But so is the centralization of our wool industry. So wool is being shipped from all the provinces to very centralized places, and everyone has been talking about this in the industry about, big projects. We need one central scouring facility and we need these big mills. And as I've sort of tried to understand how that makes sense, I've realized that actually we need to think smaller on this. We need to think regional processing, a hub in every region in the country. So we're limiting transportation miles of this resource. We're building economic viability in small rural communities and providing jobs in places where jobs aren't easy to come by. We're situating those where they are resource rich and could be better spent. Those dollars could be better spent rather than in a centralized location that maybe doesn't have the water resources water or energy resources that is needed. And it addresses the needs of those communities specifically, rather than trying to fit everything into one big plan. In Manitoba we have uh, really good range sheep operations where they are producing really fine textiles, the wool that would be actually very good for clothing. So it makes sense to put in infrastructure that is actually producing textiles rather than doing that in Ontario, where the majority of the farms are intensively managed and the wool is less textile quality and better for insulation. So let's, adapt the infrastructure and the plans to accommodate the land base and the breeds of sheep that are being raised on those land bases.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like a big thing that like a big picture that everyone has, and maybe something that's people are struggling with across Canada, but breaking it up into smaller contexts and smaller facilities makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I know that isn't that it's counter a lot of people think it's counterintuitive to, that we need more for the industry, so let's think big. And I'm saying we need more for the industry, let's think smaller and contextual.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's great. Um, okay, I have kind of a weird it's a weird question, so don't feel like there's a right or wrong answer, but
Okay.
um so us just talking about regenerative practices and things like that. So for all those who don't know, a part of the regenerative accelerator program was they were given mentorship to help plan a project, as well as money to go along with that project, and monitoring of their farm. So we conducted EOV monitoring on all the farms and Anna's farm, and so that is a landscape methodology for measuring ecological health. And so we're kind of monitoring the four primary ecosystem processes that are involved in any ecosystem, which is the water cycle, mineral cycle, energy flow, and community dynamic. And one of the things that so one of the processes that we're monitoring is the community dynamic. So that's looking at the diverse species of plants and insects and animals, and how those relationship between all those different species interact and work together, which creates up a healthy ecosystem. And so community dynamic is something that can also be talked about in terms of human relationships and the people in your community. So if I was to ask you, Anna, if you were having a conversation with your neighbor about how to improve community dynamic, not necessarily talking about the ecology of the land in that community dynamic, but just the community dynamic of you and your neighbors and fellow producers, what would that kind of conversation kind of look like? What do you think the main topics would be that you'd want to talk about with your neighbors about how you could positively influence the community dynamic of fiber farming?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Um, well, I guess maybe my answer is I see us as being in I mean, we all exist in multiple different communities, and some of them are very geographically close and some of them are not. And with fiber farming, we're a pretty small group of people. Um and so I feel like I'm a part of this bigger community of fiber farmers across the country. And I would say in that context, the biggest thing we can do is continue encouraging and sharing information and resources with each other, because we don't really necessarily fit in other communities. Um, and that can be really challenging. We just seem like sheep farmers, but then our focus and our marketing and our processing is so different that it feels a little bit isolating. So in that case, working to build network and community is really important. In my local geographical community, I feel like the conversation or what is necessary is more about building connection. I don't know. Uh, I think people thought we were a little nuts when we moved to Manitoba from Vancouver, and certainly people in our community wondered what we were up to, and they probably still wonder what we're up to. But creating those opportunities for connection has been so valuable, and whether it's offering help or assistance or tools, or one of the most uh, community building things that I would say happen in my community is when the roads are icy and awful and we're helping each other out of ditches, and those conversations that happen in those 10 or 15-minute pockets after we've pulled someone out of the ditch or we've helped someone get over a snowbank, um, creates connection and creates opportunity to talk about how to build a more vibrant and resilient community, no matter what we're doing, whether people are farming or um, commuting to the city, which happens a lot in our community, or talking about diversity of species, and or talking about fiber versus meat farming. So I'm not sure if that answered your question,
No,
but
that's great.
I feel
No,
for
very
me,
good.
like, connection is just so important, and it's really the first step in education and understanding.
Right. Okay, cool. What is something that you would say to somebody who has no experience, nobody in their family's ever farmed, but they would like to start? What would be some advice that you could give them?
Oh, wow. Well, I do think that the Young Agrarian program is absolutely fantastic, and I'm so thankful that I was able to work with them this year and have an apprentice, which was awesome. And I think if someone wants to get into farming, that might be a great first step. Um, that wasn't necessarily an option for me, or I wasn't aware of it. So I think also the next best step is to just jump in and do it and be willing to learn and make those mistakes, and just get started in whatever way that looks, whether that's like, you know, a tiny little urban garden or a small plot of land somewhere, is just get started.
Yeah, just start somewhere. That's great advice. You never know until you actually try.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so maybe we'll just end this session with sharing some resources with our listeners. So, where can they hear more from you or follow along your journey? Do you guys have social media or newsletter, or anything like that, or somewhere where they could purchase your products from your farm?
Yeah, so we have a website, longwayhomestead.com, and we have a monthly newsletter, as well as an online farm shop where we sell, yarn and fiber and wool pillows and other wool-based products. We're on Instagram at Longway Homestead. Those are probably the two best places to find out what we're up to. And I also encourage people to check out fibershed.com in California. And if you are looking for a regional chapter of Fibershed, they have a listing there, and there's quite a few fiber sheds across Canada. And it's a fantastic organization that really works to promote local, sustainable textile production wherever we are.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks. And anything that you're working on right now, or anything else that you want to share with our listeners?
Well, I've just written a book, which I'm pretty excited about. It'll be coming out in March. It's called Sheep, Shepherd, and Land, and it looks at the connection between sheep breeds and the various land bases across Canada and the shepherds who are trying to reinvigorate the wool industry in Canada. So I'm pretty proud about that, and excited for the opportunities that it will create, and that those that are working so hard on fiber farming can create to change the industry and really bring textile agriculture to the forefront.
Awesome. That's amazing. And where can we buy this book?
You could buy it on my website, longwayhomestead.com, or through the publishers 910 Publications.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Okay, and so to hear more about Longway and Anna Hunter and her farm and the other farms that participate in the accelerator program, you can go to www.holisticmanagement.com, where we'll be posting the interviews as well as a little summary of their farm and their story. To To learn more about holistic management, regenerative farming principles, and the farms in Manitoba that are implementing these practices, check out our Instagram and Facebook page or visit our website at holisticmanagement.ca. And make sure to sign up to our newsletter so we can let you know about all the upcoming events and learning opportunities in your area. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to discuss in the future on this podcast, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. For our soil's sake, thanks for listening in, everyone.